Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation. I'm Bev Neufeld, and I'm president of PowHer New York. For those of you who don't know us, we're an inclusive network of over 100 organizations across New York State. We represent different issues, different folks, different concerns, but we come together with a collective goal of attaining women's economic equality. And we focus on women, on people of color, and on gender expansive individuals in our work. Really exciting to have this panel today, Dismantling Sexual Harassment in Albany. And I want to thank ahead of time our partners, Time's Up and the Sexual Harassment Working Group, for joining us today, for partnering with us in all the work you have been doing on this issue. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. We'd like you to use the chat feature to find the bios of each speaker, and also to put questions. There will be a question and answer period. You can also use the Q&A function if you prefer. If you are on social media, remember to tag us. And if you have any questions or concerns or problems, just email us at info@powherny.org. Today's conversation is grounded in the collective work of PowHer Network. In 2020, during the pandemic, we came together to look at what was happening for women and to try to think forward about how we could come out of this time better than when we started. During that time, about 50 organizations worked virtually online to create a document that we called A Roadmap to Inclusive Gender Justice. It's our foundational document. It has a vision for a transformational change and looks at 8 important issues that need to be addressed and has a plan of action in those. Today, we're talking about actually a topic that hits 3 of those issues: gender-based violence, employment, and women's representation and leadership. This conversation today, it's not about a person or about an incident. It's about a pervasive, historic environment, a system that disadvantages those who try to enter, those who seek a seat at the table. We encourage women to run for office. We ask them to go into the political fray, to advocate for gender justice issues, to influence policy and spending. But often we are sending them into not just an unwelcoming environment, but one that's hostile and dangerous. Why does this happen? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. It's certainly because of gender, race, and other conditions, about them being the other, about them wanting in. But the personal and professional consequences are substantial and real. They are career-changing, sometimes life-changing when people experience the sexual harassment that we'll be talking about. Not only is it personal for the individual, but it's an obstacle to our progress to move forward, to create an inclusive and equitable society, to reach those goals and to change those issues that we care so deeply about. So I'm really excited to invite our expert panel to discuss this today. And to kick it off, we have our moderator, who is Karen King. Karen is the Commissioner of Public Advocacy for Erie County, and she's the Executive Director of the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women. She also serves on the New York State Council for Women and Girls, and I'm really proud to say that she's as well a board member of PowHer New York. So Karen, let's have a conversation. Go ahead.
Thank you, Bev, and welcome to everyone who has joined us this afternoon. We're really excited to be launching this series, and this will be an ongoing conversation. And I just want to say a few words to frame our conversation today, because essentially we're talking about power dynamics of patriarchy and white supremacy and the effects they have in the workplace, with a particular focus on Albany today, and contribute to a toxic environment where sexual harassment takes place with little opposition or support for the victims. This is a macro problem, part of a larger conversation about the power that white men in particular exert over others in any patriarchal system. We envision this initial conversation as part of a series, a think tank, where we can unpack these issues of sexual harassment, understand its roots and the culture that permits it to continue, and propose solutions for change in the harmful culture in Albany and other workplaces where sexual harassment is permitted to continue. And in terms of framing, we are really going to try to approach this through an intersectional lens, which the term intersectionality has gotten a lot of traction and play in the last year, but law scholar and anti-racist feminist Kimberly Crenshaw created this as a frame or a prism to see and understand the cracks in the law and the intersection of oppression and the ways systems of power overlap and intersect. And that will really inform our conversation today. We're also going to look at the way power dynamics play out. Misogyny and abusive power infect every political and ideological space. And dismantling the systems that support harassers requires serious commitment from everyone in those spaces. Upending this long-standing system of oppression will take more than good personal behavior. So we really need to understand that these are structures, of course, that are supported by individuals, but they're structures and systems that are entrenched and really need to be understood as such. We won't win this struggle for gender liberation until we focus more on the perpetrators, men, masculinity, rather than on survivors and women and femininity. And in many cases, this means holding men accountable. So one of the overarching questions is, how do we individuals and the wider culture begin to reframe masculinity in healthier ways? So that is just the initial framework. We are going to delve into the conversation, and I'm so honored to have our esteemed panelists with us this afternoon. So let me first introduce our first panelist. Lateefah Lyles is the Vice President of Advocacy and Survivor Initiatives and leads Time's Up advocacy agenda for public policy and private sector change and its efforts to advocate for survivors of sexual harassment and assault. Lateefah brings more than 15 years of movement experience working on issues of economic justice and equality for women, workers, and survivors. Please welcome Lateefah Lyles. Good afternoon.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and to be part of this critical conversation. I want to, on behalf of Time's Up, commend you folks doing this great work in New York and paving the way for others across the nation to organize, to come together and to really make some, as you pointed out, systemic change around this critical issue. A little bit about Time's Up and my role there. You know, we think of ourselves as a startup organization. You know, it's the first, you know, there are startups and then there are startups, but we really do think of ourselves as this organization that, as some of you may know, was born out of people who were breaking the silence. 300 women in entertainment, getting to work, tackling the pressing gender equity needs in various industries. And then we launched the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund in 2008, which is administered by our partner, the National Women's Law Center. And then we have Time's Up Now, which is the organization where I work, which is the advocacy arm that I'm here representing. And, you know, we work at many of the intersections that you mentioned and that we're talking about today. Ultimately, we're working to prevent sexual harassment and the related forms of discrimination in the first place. And it's important that we say related because in our view, all of these issues are interconnected. So in the same time, we are talking about what barriers women face in the workplace in order to have a level playing field, participate in our economy, and to live sustainable lives without fear in the workplace in particular is just as important as making sure that when harassment or violence occurs, there are systems that can provide transparency, justice, and accountability in those instances. So all of that working together, we really believe that this is not going to be done by one tactic. This is something that we all have to do in multiple forms and in multiple ways. Our theory is that if we take culture, policy reform, and private sector solutions, meaning what's happening already in the private sector, what can we do to drive innovation, and what can we do to leverage what's happening on the ground with employers on this broader stage of policy change. And of course, I know firsthand from my work at the Labor Department that sometimes and oftentimes the state level is where we have the best labs of innovation, and how we can move policy forward often is because we have leadership across the country who can say, this works. We have folks who can tell you it works. We can make the business case. We've done all the work, and despite the log jams and the bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., we know that there are folks really taking the lead on issues such as sexual harassment in the workplace across the nation, despite the fact that we don't have what we believe are a core set of principles as in the public policy arena at the federal level yet, but hopefully we can get there. The root cause, we talk about institutional change, the root causes of harassment and discrimination is really critical, and it's at every level of society. We want to make sure that people can come together, hold up these issues, and ultimately hold leadership accountable. And I know that's a really core message that you all put forward in your work. We know that voters understand in some of the work we've been doing over the past year, looking at what the public opinions are on the issues of sexual harassment. We know that at its core, voters even understand that this is about power. They recognize that the workplace and work-related settings are most likely where these things can occur. And it's not the case that people don't think about, prioritize, and believe it's important to address these issues. We know that we can try to move this forward so that it shows up more in our political discourse at the ballot box, allowing us to engage more voters on this issue, and we hope to continue to do that. We know that there are just the tip of the iceberg and the depth of these problems. Right now, the data that we usually rely on is as a result of people who come forward with claims or have filed cases. And that is, as I don't have to tell anybody on this panel, on this audience, we know is just not really getting to how often this happens and how pervasive the issues of sexual harassment are in all workplaces. And part of those reasons, which part of the solutions and the theory and the ideas that we're talking about is because of, regardless if you have a policy or not, how are survivors treated across the continuum of this horrible experience? When people come forward, we know there's retaliation. We have a report coming out soon that talks about the real cost of retaliation, of discrimination, the real cost of what it means to put yourself on the line, to put your job and your family and your economic security on the line. We have a report coming out very soon that is going to discuss how we can shift the power dynamics and what we know about some of the economic effects, including the fact that women who are sexually harassed, in our finding, in this survey that we did, are 6 times more likely to change jobs. We know that it creates insecurity. People have to change industry. They have to get education. They have to completely, in some case, uproot their lives because they live in a small town. They work at a small organization. They're part of a culture. We hope that we're able to use this research to not just talk about the emotional and the human toll, but what sexual harassment is really costing us as a nation, economically, what it's costing our businesses, and what it's costing our families. Beyond the personal toll, we know that the high cost can be as simple as having to apply for unemployment and not having a job for several months, to having credit destroyed, having to lose your apartment, because you can't make a bill, or you have late payments on your mortgage. You have employer-sponsored health benefits, and you lose those health benefits because you have to change out of your job. You have been forced to resign, or the situation or the workplace is not safe for you anymore. It can be detrimental and long-lasting and really limit career advancement and economic security. So it's something we believe is going to be very critical to how we bring this conversation out into the broader community and to the broader private sector community to talk about, as employers, what can be done and really what's at stake. We were really excited to work with on the New York safety agenda. We're proud of that collaboration, working on New York's anti-harassment laws, knowing that you have one of the strongest in the nation. We are hoping that we will continue this work as we look to 2022, building on our hashtag We Have Our Back campaign that we put out last year during the presidential race, where we essentially were talking about the perpetuating sexist narratives that which have derailed women's careers for decades, and how there are so many different pieces and parts that prevent women from fully participating. And that's what this comes down to at the end of the day. It's whether you are working on a campaign, whether you're running for office yourself, whether you are hoping to get a political appointment. The ripple effect of this down the pipeline of trying to get to diversity and inclusion is also affected by this really systemic and horrible issue. And so if we really are going to commit to building that pipeline and opening up access to more people in our political process, this is one of those things at its core that has to be addressed. And I look forward to talking more during our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Latifa. A wealth of information in that very condensed time, and we all look forward to the report and discussing that as well. So, and we will circle back with some of the points that you brought up towards the end of our discussion. So next, I'm very excited to introduce our next panelist. Assembly Member Catalina Cruz, representing District 39, has committed her career to fighting to ensure workers, neighbors, and families not only survive, but thrive. She is an experienced attorney, a leader for tenant protections, immigration reform, and workers' rights, and has worked to help pass key legislation protecting workers, women, and small business owners. We are very honored to be joined this afternoon by Assemblywoman Cruz. Good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon, Karen, and thank you for having me. I have spent most of my legal career as a worker rights attorney, focusing mainly on immigration. So when we talk about the pervasive sexual harassment in our workplace, both in the private and public sector, it's something that I myself am very familiar with, not only as an attorney, but on a personal level. You know, I have been working since I got elected in 2018, when I took office in 2019, with the Sexual Harassment Working Group, with Erica and the amazing team that have helped us build the kind of legislation that really gets not only at the root of the problem when we were talking about the pervasive sexual harassment within Albany, but also within the workplace throughout the state, but really looking at the idea that sometimes you gotta deter behavior with a little bit of a stronger hand, that it's not just about the training, but if we are not convincing folks to do the right thing via training, then we gotta look at punishment, we gotta look at financial consequences for the wrong actions that folks are undertaking. I happen to represent workers that are very vulnerable as members of my community. We're talking immigrant mothers, many of them undocumented. We're talking the kinds of folks who during the pandemic had no choice but to work. You know, and I think when we speak about sexual harassment, we often our mind immediately goes to the professional sector, the kind of workplace that many of us are used to being at. We think about Albany, but we also need to think about what happens to our service workers, the women who are taking care of our kids, the restaurant workers, the supermarket workers, the kind of workers that if their supervisor, I'll just say it, begins to sexually harass them, ask for a sexual favor in exchange for a shift or for increased salary, they're going to have a much harder time defending themselves. And that is why we work to change that. Over the last couple of years since I've been in office, we've seen the culture in Albany take, I would argue, a drastic change. I used to be a staffer for a very long time. And I think Erica has heard me speak about before how I would purposely dress a certain way to not attract attention, because that's the reality of the world we were living in. And now with more women being in office, with more women being in leadership positions, even within our teams, we feel much more comfortable being who we are, because we shouldn't have to feel afraid to go to work every day and think that, you know, a colleague or another staffer is going to sexually harass us, because that's the reality that Albany had faced for a very long time. You know, and everything from implementing training requirements to creating the kind of atmosphere that allowed us to even have this conversation. You know, under the leadership of Alessandra, you know, we had our very first hearing on the issue in decades. You know, no one had actually talked about this openly, and about the kind of workplace that many of us were forced to be a part of while we were in Albany. And to see it, to see something as basic as a hearing create the kind of a system that allowed us to have the conversation was incredible, and to be a part of that. And you know, now we're looking at various pieces of legislation that really tackle everything from if you want to be a part of our system, meaning the policymaking system, if you're going to be a lobbyist, if you're going to be a legislator, what are we changing? What requirements are we placing on you to have training, to abide by the rules, and what happens if you don't abide by them? I myself, I'm carrying a bill that basically says if you're a lobbyist, you have to take this particular type of training to make sure that you are fully aware. I mean, one would argue you should be aware that you shouldn't be sexually harassing anyone, but to make sure that you understand that the privilege of getting to advocate for your client can be taken away if you're not going to respect our rules and our regulations. We have other laws that we're working on that go to protect the folks who come forward and speak up. And I say folks because while the majority of the survivors have been women, and folks who identify as women, we can't be blind to the fact that we have members of our LGBTQI community who could be facing harassment now in the workplace in Albany, as well as the men. And so how do we protect them to make sure that we are creating an entire ecosystem within the workplace in Albany and outside of Albany? And I keep on saying Albany because we got to lead by example. We can't go out and make laws that are going to tackle the issues in the private sector or even the public sector outside of Albany if we're not cleaning house. And we have to lead by example. And so we are creating the kind of laws that also say, if you are coming forward and if you decide that you're going to take a settlement, that shouldn't bar you from ever being a part of our system. That shouldn't bar you from getting a job in another place within our legislature, be the Senate, the Assembly, and another piece, a part of government. Because that's been the routine. The routine has been to place these clauses that basically bar you from ever re-entering the kind of industry that you've come to love and that someone basically pushed you out of because of their own wrong behavior. And so that's another piece that we're looking at. And I'm going to leave it at that because I look forward to the conversation we're going to have. But I think the most important thing that I've seen over the last 2 years is a change in culture that allows us to even have a conversation like what we're having now. I have been a staffer on and off for the last 10 years. I was a staffer at the city council where routinely I would get eyeballed, and thankfully I had an amazing boss who stood up for me every time. But I don't ever remember a conversation like this happening there. I don't ever remember a conversation like this happening in the state legislature when I was a staffer for agencies. And so the simple fact that we're changing that piece, that we now are openly speaking about it, and that we have the support of women, that we have the support of, I see Stanley is going to be with us today, who I adore, that we have the support of just the kind of folks who understand that unless we clean house in Albany, we have, in Spanish we say, no tenemos cara. We can't really go out and face the world and say, well, you, the private sector, should be really protecting your workers if we can't do that for our own.
Thank you, Assemblymember Cruz, and certainly we are hopeful and feel that change is afoot, and that we are at an important pivot point, and we'll explore that further. Thank you. Our next panelist, Erica Vladimir, is a co-founder of New York State Sexual Harassment Working Group, a workers' collective of former government legislative staffers who've experienced sexual harassment, abuse, and retaliation at the hands of elected and appointed officials. Erica, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you, PowHer, for asking me to join this panel, and for asking the Sexual Harassment Working Group to co-sponsor and co-host this event. And thank you to the panelists who I'm so grateful to be here with. And I'm looking forward to the day that we can automatically believe that we're going to do this in person together. And so I can give everybody a really big hug before and after the panel. Because the fact is that these types of conversations, they are very important, but they are also very difficult. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there might be some people who are sitting and listening in who have their own experiences, who have either reported them talked about them publicly, who have told maybe some family and friends, or who have not told anybody else. And when you hear these kinds of things, even when you're talking about it in the way that we are here today, it can be really difficult. And for some of us, I know for myself personally, that difficulty, that doesn't go away. It's hard to leave that trauma behind. But what I do know is that public conversations like this, although they might be difficult, they're also part of the healing process. And that's why I think it's so important for us to continue these public conversations. That's why it was one of the main fights that the working group took on when we first formed back in 2018, was to start having public conversations, because we know that sexual harassment, all types of harassment and discrimination, more often than not, happen behind closed doors, where most people can't see them. And when that happens, the darkness is not only over the environment creating the toxicity that we're trying to dismantle, but that darkness can be held by the people who experience that trauma. And one of the ways to heal, one of the ways to change the culture, is to let the light in. And that starts by having these conversations, normalizing these conversations, because sadly, this type of harassment and discrimination, especially sexual harassment, especially up in Albany, is normal. There are not many of us who have spoken out. I first spoke out in January of 2018 after I was a staffer up in Albany, much like the assembly member was back, before she was elected, for a state senator who decided to shove his tongue down my throat. And it took me years to come forward. And I came forward because I realized that by not telling my story, I was possibly leaving other people behind, and perpetuating this idea that what happened behind those closed doors had to stay behind closed doors. And that put other people at risk. And so by having these types of conversations, we know that we're letting other people know that they are not alone, and that this is something that we know is not normal, however normalized it might be. And so when the working group started in 2018, and we asked the state legislature and the governor to slow down and include survivors in the process, what we were really asking for was for a vocal public seat at the table. For people with the lived experiences that we have all had, as Karen mentioned, we are a workers collective. Everybody has experienced harassment, discrimination, or retaliation at the hands of elected and appointed officials, both at the city and state level, while working for the city and state legislature. And we knew that it was our experiences that was going to help change the system. Unfortunately, we were not provided that seat at the first instance. And so we took it upon ourselves to work with elected officials, work with other experts and advocates in creating policies that we knew would have helped us in our specific situations. Once we rolled that out in June of 2018, we also knew that our experiences weren't the only ones that mattered. They were siloed. They were in Albany in a specific kind of workplace, and that other people, and I know Sifa had discussed this, Catalina brought it up as well, is that across all industries, there are workers who are experiencing harassment and discrimination and feel like they have no choice because that's how they put food on the table. That's how they secure health insurance for themselves and for their families. That's how they make sure that they can pay the rent on a month-to-month basis and make sure that there is some type of roof, and hopefully a safe roof, over their family's head. We shouldn't put our human dignity at risk just so we can live a dignified life, and that's what has been asked of us. And the working group wanted to fight to create space so every worker can talk about their lived experiences, whether they had talked about it in the past or they had yet to talk about it. And so with the help of elected officials like State Senator Alessandra Biaggi and former Assembly Member Arabella Simotis and so many others, we were able to secure the first joint legislative public hearing on sexual harassment in the workplace in New York State, the first time in nearly 30 years. The last time it had happened before that, which was February 2019, was under Governor Mario Cuomo, when he created a commission that went around the state and did regional hearings. And what is somewhat unsurprising, but also sad and a little bit shocking, is that what they found 27 years ago are the same things that came out of these hearings back in 2019, which shows that we know how to identify the problem. The issue with that and the next step is what we call, the working group has really focused on, is institutional courage. And this comes from a brilliant woman, Dr. Jennifer Freyd, out on the West Coast, who has really been studying and coined DARVO, deny, attack, reverse, victim, offender. And this is the type of attitude and actions that people, alleged harmers, take when they are brought forward and tried to be held accountable for their actions. And one way we can dismantle a system that protects abusers and harassers and discriminators is by showing institutional courage, is that people around them, let's say an elected official, people around them, their colleagues, the people who work for them, the other people, the other elected officials in different branches, stepping up and truly standing next to the survivors, and not just saying the words, believe all women, believe all survivors, but actually acting on it. That is institutional courage. And that is truly what we see is lacking in Albany. And this is not a legal change that can be made, right? And Catalina had alluded to this, and so did Latifa. We can change all the policies, we can change all the laws that we want to. But if we don't have people in office who are willing to hold themselves and each other accountable to those laws and to those policies, then they are only worth the paper that they are printed on. And we deserve better. Workers in New York State who work for the government, who work in public service, people who work across all industries deserve better. And it starts by having the people who are in a position of power holding themselves and each other accountable. And that is institutional courage. And I will say, and I think I might cramp Stanley's style a little bit here, but Stanley wrote something brilliant through his Medium page that he posted not too long ago about what it meant for him to see someone, a colleague of his, being harassed while up in Albany advocating one time, and reflecting on the fact that he could have done better. That is institutional courage. And that is what we need if we are going to change the culture, because this is a type of power abuse. And we know that power abuse is rampant up in Albany. But if we don't have people who are willing to own their actions or truly own their inactions and commit to doing better, we are not going to change the culture. And that means that the laws and policies that we are fighting for are not going to carry the weight that they deserve to carry. We are not going to have the protections as workers that we deserve. And frankly, that means that countless people are going to leave public service. I think about this every day, the number of powerful women who never had the opportunity to run for office. Thank God we have people like Catalina in office, right? Who had the experiences and is channeling her lived experiences to make a better New York State for people who are coming after her, for people who are here now. But imagine how many people left. I left for a few years. I didn't feel like I belonged after my experience. We want to make sure we want to change that culture, because that is going to change the dynamic. That is going to change our representation. And that is going to that's what's really going to make a harassment-free Albany and a harassment-free New York. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you for your courage. And we all must really take a deep dive into understanding this concept of institutional courage and how it has to be designed and implemented. So thank you for your work and your continued advocacy. Ooh, wow. Next panelist. Stanley Fritz is the political and campaign director for Citizens Action of New York. Most recently, he helped lead Citizens Action's Invest in Our New York and Free New York legislative campaigns. He is also co-founder and creative director of Let's Not Be Trash, a social media platform dedicated to discussing and unpacking gender, sexuality, and patriarchy through literature, education, and conversation. Please welcome Stanley Fritz.
Hey folks, good afternoon. Happy Wednesday. First off, I just want to thank everyone for having me on here. It's a pleasure and an honor to be in this space with so many brilliant people. And obviously another shout out to my good friend and definitely Cheryl Erica Vladimir, who she was a big part of like why I wrote that piece. When everything was happening with Cuomo with the accusations, one of the things I thought long and hard about was like, what could I be doing to better show up? And you know, I love to write. That's my passion. I do organizing, activism, politics by day, but I'm an armchair liberal by night. And I wanted to figure out how I could put those armchair liberal powers to good use. So I share that story of an experience that happened to me my first year working at Citizen Action of New York. So I've been thinking about patriarchy, sexism, and harassment for a couple of years now. And one of the big things I've taken away from it more than anything is that on its face, most men don't even understand that what they're doing is wrong. And does it make it okay? No. Does it mean that we should forget about it and give men space? Absolutely not. But it does speak to the kind of society that we have, where we have made sure to front load these harmful ideas about masculinity, about leadership, about the ways you can engage with the opposite sex or the same sex, and about accountability. I know growing up, my dad used to always tell me, you do whatever you can to get what you want from a woman. That's what you do. You lie, you curse, you steal, you learn a new language. He learned Dutch so he can impress women. And in every space I went to that was male dominated, there was a culture of men being able to do whatever they wanted to do because that's what men are supposed to do. It wasn't just an idea anymore, it was an obligation. It was something I was supposed to live up to. And I think you're seeing a lot of that happen in Albany as well. But on top of all that bad socialization, we're also dealing with folks who, some are far too drunk on power. Some are there for all the bad reasons. Some of them are there because they can get away with it because they know not enough people will speak. Because as Erica mentioned and other people have mentioned, folks have to worry about keeping their jobs, paying their bills, making sure that they can take care of their loved ones. And you can't do that if your job is in danger. And far too often, the people with the power tend to be male and they tend to not have the best ideas about healthy workspaces. But how do we change that? That's the big question. So first off, we have this mandatory sexual harassment training that everyone in the state has to do, right? I've done it several times now, and I gotta tell you, it is boring. It is not very helpful. The only thing I look forward to in that training are the really, really poorly acted reenactments because they're always hilarious. But the basis of that training is not about how to be a better person. It is not about accountability. It is actually about, to be clear, how not to get sued and how not to get your company or organization sued. And now listen, no one wants to be sued. Me, I'm poor. I can barely afford to pay attention. So if you sue me, I'm in trouble. But that should not be the motivation for not wanting to commit sexual harassment or make uncomfortable workspaces for people. And I think the first thing we need to do is reframe the way we're having these conversations about harassment. It shouldn't be a thing you have to do once a year or once a quarter because you supervise people and your organization doesn't want to get in trouble with the state or they don't want to be liable for a lawsuit. It should be happening consistently. It should be baked into all the work that we do, all the conversations that we have until it is a part of the social fabric of wherever you are. That's one. Two, when we're talking about harassment, workplace harassment, harassment of anyone, particularly in Albany, I think it's very important that we have to make sure that we're having a conversation about the impact. I'm going to speak for myself, but I think I speak for a lot of men when I say for a long time, I did not understand the impact of my behavior because I was not taught to understand the humanity of women. And it wasn't that I didn't grow up with women, brilliant, amazing, kind, wonderful women in my life. But for some reason, I had done the mental gymnastic where I separated the women that I knew into one side and the women that I didn't know into another side. So I can humanize my mother or my sister or my friend, but I couldn't humanize the woman down the street. And I think a lot of men have that problem. They just cannot see the humanity in women. And because of that, and because of the ideas that we are told about masculinity and the way we're supposed to show up, we're doing things and we're not even thinking about who it's going to hurt, how it makes them feel, how it makes the space unhealthy. And then when we're not talking about directly engaging with women and we're talking about leadership, we've also got all of the wrong lessons. We've been told that leadership looks like one thing, a charismatic person making all the decisions. They are the all-powerful person. It is a competition. It is a challenge. And the best way to get things done is to dominate. And when we've seen different examples of leadership styles and it doesn't fit within that framework, it's criticized. So I'll use an example of a leadership style that I actually appreciate. So Andrea Stewart-Cousins, the majority leader of the New York State Senate, has a reputation of being somebody who listens to her conference. But what does that actually mean? Well, it means that before she decides what direction the conference is going to go when it pertains to legislation or their position on an issue, she listens to the conference. She has conversations with people. She has one-on-ones. She makes committees so people can talk things through and hash it out. And then she gets a recommendation and considers it with whatever she's thinking, and they make a decision as a team. That kind of leadership style, in my opinion, is the best one because it gives you the opportunity to make a decision that's very informed. It gives your team the opportunity to be heard and give feedback and feel like they're a part of the process. So no matter what direction you go in, everybody feels heard and seen and feels clear. That's not very masculine. If you ask most people what a great idea of leadership is, and if a male did that or a man did that, they would be seen as weak or as someone who could be taken advantage of. And instead, what you get are these people who think they have to come into a space and rule it with an iron fist. So as we're talking about re-socializing men so that we can understand the harm that we are causing, so that we can understand and see the humanity in women, and that we can make sure we're not actually causing harm consistently in professional, personal, or just casual spaces, we also have to make sure we're having a new conversation about what leadership looks like. Leadership does not look like you forcing someone's hand, then taking the credit. Leadership does not look like you ignoring a problem for as long as you can, and then when you decide it benefits you, doing something about it, but only doing it in a way that only helps you. Leadership does not look like going to a group of people and telling them what to do and then yelling at them and micromanaging them. But those are all things we've been told is leadership. Leadership looks like service. It looks like listening. It looks like collaboration. It looks like process, systems, and teamwork. And we got to move away from this idea that that framework right there is inherently feminine. And if it is inherently feminine, we have to shift this idea that femininity is a bad thing, because it is absolutely not. And once we start attacking those pieces and those components, I think we'll be right along our way in helping to decolonize the minds of men like myself and others so that you won't see so many examples of harassment. But while that's happening, We have to make sure that when there are people who will not engage, when there are bad actors, and we've got a couple of bad actors, there has to be a very clear line so that they're held accountable. Now, I think that men cause the problem of sexism and patriarchy and harassment. So I think it's our job to fix it. We broke it, we fixed it. It's not women's jobs. Women have had to live with it and they have excelled despite it, right? So we messed it up, we got to take care of it. Having said all that, we have to make sure we are listening to the people who have been directly impacted by harassment, patriarchy, sexism, male privilege. And it's not men, it's not Stanley, who has always been given a front row seat to speak because I just happen to be tall, I have a deep voice, and I like the sound of my voice at the same time. So we had to make sure we're creating space to listen to these women and find out what's going on. And then when there are bad actors, you need to make them uncomfortable. And I'm talking to the men here now, actually. When you are in a meeting and someone gets out of line and raises their voice at a colleague, a female colleague, and you know they wouldn't do that if it was a male colleague, you need to make them uncomfortable. I'm not saying you need to fight them or yell at them, but you have to call it out. Because as a man, you do have the privilege in that space. You have to say, this is wrong. You cannot do this. That is inappropriate. It also means that when there are bad actors, no matter what role they have, no matter what they've done, no matter who they are to us, we have to hold them accountable. Period. And accountability does not mean cancel. You can't cancel anybody. If they're canceled, they're dead. And guess what? People are continuously evolving and changing forever, or at least until they die. So as long as they're alive, there is an opportunity to keep on moving, and we should be working with people. I got to tell you, the Stanley Fritz from 2012 is much different from the Stanley Fritz in 2021. And the Stanley Fritz in 2012, if I could read some of the things that Stanley said or thought, I'd be really embarrassed, and you guys would probably be really mad at me. But I had the space to learn and to grow. And I had a lot of overworked and overstressed women who did the work to educate me. And so I got to a point when I realized, oh, wow, this is not good. And now every day, my simple goal is to just be less trash. And what do we mean by this concept of trashness? It doesn't mean that you're a horrible person. It doesn't mean that you are evil. It doesn't mean that you need to be destroyed. But it does mean that as a man, I can show up in ways that is just not good. And because I love slang, in Brooklyn, we say trash when something is not good. I want to be less trash. I'll have moments where I'll slip up, and I want to be accountable to that. And I want to have space where people can forgive me, but every day I am aspiring to be a little bit better, because we're not going to dismantle all these systems that cause these problems right away, but we can decolonize our minds and others. So thank you, folks.
Wow, thank you. It's the new and improved Stanley.
I'm trying.
The reboot. Very powerful statements, and really speaks to this idea of oversight and accountability, and the concept of privilege, because what male privilege allows is the freedom to decide when you want to be enlightened, when you want to be engaged, and when you don't want to, and having the latitude to ignore that. So thank you for really clarifying that, Stanley. So right now we are going to have a discussion with all the panelists. We'll have some questions coming in, and I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists for sharing your thoughts and your experiences and your brilliance this afternoon. I think we are off to a very important and depthful start to this ongoing conversation around this very complex issue. And one of the themes that came up a few times, and Stanley, you certainly touched upon it, was this idea of leadership, right? And what needs to happen in terms of change and systemic change, and how systems are changed. And I want to read an interesting quote about our concept of leadership here in Western culture from Dr. Helena Liu. She says in her book, Redeeming Leadership, leadership holds a mythic status in our culture. Few of us can agree on what leadership is, yet many believe that it's inherently good and urgently needed. Irrespective of the organizational predicament or societal crises, leadership is often prescribed as the panacea that will solve all ills. Our romance with leadership has kept the business of leadership, theorizing, development, and consultancy profitable while maintaining systems of power. So what I really want to ask you, because we're talking about systems, and particularly in Albany and political systems are incredibly hierarchical, right? So can we create or reimagine systems and power and hierarchy through a different lens where it is inclusive and socially just? And I'm going to throw that out. I'm going to take myself off the camera, and any one of you can jump in to respond to that question.
I'll go. And I do want to use Catalina as an example for this, because I think one way to do that is to ensure that the people who are in a position of power are the people who have lived experiences, and to recognize that the people who are in a position of power would not be where they are without the people who they surround themselves with. And sometimes that can be a good thing, and sometimes that can be a bad thing. And what we need to do is lift people up like Catalina, who was a staffer. I'm telling you, no elected official would be where they are without their staff. And unfortunately, staff are treated like crap by the system. They are underpaid, they are overworked, they have less protections if they are public employees than private employees. And so we need to strengthen the protections and lift up the people who are around those in power. And when you have elected officials who have been there before, who have been the staffers, who have committed themselves to public service, regardless of the harassment and discrimination that they had to face, regardless of the low pay and the long hours, they get it. They know what the staffers are going through. And so they are more mindful about that and more willing to step up and, again, show that institutional courage and protect their staffers as much as they can in this toxic culture that we have. And so I think one way to change that and make it more socially just is to make sure that we are protecting those at the quote unquote bottom and recognizing that they actually have to be the ones that are at the top. That when it's the elected officials who are standing on the floor at 3 o'clock in the morning and giving their speeches, there's a staffer behind them that has been up for 48 hours negotiating that budget and is running papers after papers to the floor so that the elected officials can read the budget. We need to empower those staffers. We need to protect those staffers because they will do even more to lift up people like Catalina who are in office, and that's what we need.
Thank you, Erica. Stanley is requesting to go next. Is that okay with everyone?
I saw Catalina unmuted, so she can go first. I can wait.
Thank you, Stanley. I totally agree with what Erica is saying, and I want to add a couple of things. First, an anecdote. You said that about running papers back and forth. That actually happened to me during the last day of session. Something didn't print out correctly, and Robin at 3 in the morning had to run to our office on the other end and bring it back. And I say that because, look, I think we'd all like to be optimistic and assume that because an elected has been a staffer, that they'd be much more understanding. But there is a seductive part on power. Sometimes many of my colleagues, and I'll say many because fortunately it's many, whether it's at federal level, state level, when you've never had power and all of a sudden you have a little bit of it, there aren't people checking you. There aren't people reminding you that at the end of the day, you still got to do your laundry. You're still a very normal person. You still got to clean your house. They forget that piece. And I have seen many elected officials who used to be staffers have an extremely high turnover. And I have heard horror stories of how they treat their staff. To me, actually, an effective elected official isn't just the one that surrounds themselves with smart people, but who's kind to their staff. And look, we all have bad days. There are days when I'm hangry and when I'm tired and I can be a not very nice person, but I will be damned if I don't fight for my team. And I feel disgusted when I see, when I hear the stories of how some of the folks around me will treat their teams. And so I think it starts with electing people, not just that have been former staffers and understand that piece of it, but who aren't in this for themselves, who aren't in this for the glory of being on TV, who are in this because they understand that if they're not there at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to pass that budget with the right team surrounding them, that the kind of community they represent will go without services, will go without the basic things that they need. And so it's all connected. And in this leadership piece, I think when we think about it, we also have to think about that piece of the seduction of power and what it means when you have the kind of leadership that is more worried about keeping the power than sharing the power.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Latifa.
Thank you. Absolutely second to all the panelists' comments and responses to this question. You know, culturally, the root of what we're talking about are these systemic imbalances and these systemic structures that are built on and in service to oppression. And so looking at the workplace or looking at the political sphere, it's not exclusive. So it's not like it only applies in some cases. It absolutely applies in this case at all, and as well. And we even know now that, you know, polling after the last election shows that people are getting this. You know, even Republicans compared to 2016 appreciate that it would be beneficial for more women to be in power than not, perceiving the power imbalances differently than they did 4 years ago, and suggesting that, you know, they're shifting, their thinking is shifting. Ultimately, you know, it's not, we see this across the board, whether at the state level or across nations, and that it really does matter who's at the table, and it really does matter who is making the decisions, creating or disrupting the culture as it is, to start to shift these imbalances that are ingrained and in some ways very structurally sound. So, you know, how we imagine a different paradigm at the same time trying to affect the structure that we don't have a choice in working in is really the challenge I think we're faced with today. What is it that we actually just need to dismantle? And while we're trying to figure out a revision, you know, what does this look like? What can we be doing to be continually disrupting and continually shifting the power imbalance in the structures that exist? And there are study after study that show when we have change in power, where, I mean, frankly, women are in power, you know, employees benefit, the policies, the supports, the culture shifts, because fundamentally, women at these high levels of power and holding these positions is not part of the design. And so, you know, it is not fodder to say that, you know, we need more women and we need more people of color. It is truly in a major intervention that is really critical to how we shift.
I want to jump in.
Thank you.
Real quick,
I'm sorry, Stan. I just want to make one announcement, because we're getting several questions from our participants or our attendees, and we will take questions from the audience at approximately 2:10. So we're just going to continue to have this panel discussion as well, but I just wanted to let our attendees know what was happening.
Thank you. So to kind of go back to that first question of like whether you can have like hierarchies and like it be healthy spaces, I just want to just say, like, let's first talk about leadership and what leadership is. Leadership is service more than anything else. If you're in a leadership position, that means you have skill sets, you have done things that have shown that you can get things done. And now you're not just someone who's quote unquote in charge, but you're a coach. You're a coach, you're a mentor, you're a supporter. That's the biggest piece. And you're helping people be accountable, but the goal is to get from point A to point B. And I think if we have a more sober understanding and like belief of what leadership is, I think we'll be in a lot better space, because there is power in leadership. There absolutely is. But with that power comes a lot of responsibility, and at least in my opinion, accountability. You know, I got a nice fancy title now. I'm like New York State political director. It's real cool, looks great on my business card, and like my friends think it's fancy, right? That's great. but that also puts me in charge of a staff of about 25 to 30 people now. Those people are going to rely on me to make sure they can get their jobs done. They're going to rely on me to make sure they can troubleshoot through issues. They're going to expect me to hold them accountable. They're going to expect me and rely on me to make sure it is a healthy space to work in. That's not power. I'm honored that these people trust me to lead them and support them in that work. And because that's the way I'm framing it, like my approach is completely different. I'm trying to do things in collaboration. I'm trying to make sure that like we're working together. I will hold people accountable when necessary, but like even that right there is through an escalating process so that like we're making sure it's done in a healthy way. So that's the first thing that's really important. The second thing that's really important is it does not matter how good you are, particularly as a male. You have blind spots and you may show up poorly sometimes. And there needs to be a real ability to be held accountable, even if it doesn't feel good. The fact of the matter is people are not gold diggers. No one wants to put their career at risk, their livelihood and their reputation at risk with an accusation when they could just keep on going about their lives and their business and doing what they have to do. If they're speaking up, it is a problem. And the fact of the matter is, I want to take a bit of a pivot and talk about assault for a second. Trigger warning, but like they say 1 out of 4 women are have been assaulted or will be assaulted. That number is underreported because most people do not report it because they get ostracized, criticized. Some people get criminalized for it. And in Albany, in a place where there's so much power and people are running their offices with not much accountability, it is very easy that if someone rubs you the wrong way, you can very quickly deal with them in a way that resolves a problem for you as a person in power and messes up their life. So people are not speaking up because it's fun or because they want money. So as we're like stepping into these leadership spaces, we got to make sure that like, 1, it's about service. 2, it's about creating safe spaces with accountability, clear systems and clear processes. And 3, not forgetting what you're there for, because we have plenty of healthy examples of hierarchies. You can look at sports teams where you have a team captain, you have a coach, you have a general manager, but the team plays together because we're all fighting for the same goal. So why do the New York Knicks get it, but we can't figure that out in Albany? Sorry for the sports reference. I can't help it.
It's an interesting analogy. I'm not 100% with you. You know, teams are teams until somebody decides to make a political statement, but that's another conversation for another day. But this idea of hierarchy and reaching a critical mass of women, to what Latifa was talking about, does the landscape change when more women get into positions of power? Because systems are so saliently kept in place, right? And we know, we've heard this story before, running for office is very different than serving in office, right? Assemblymember Cruz, you could speak to that. So what happens when you get into the system, and to Latifa's point, if you want to change it, we have to really literally gut it. You know, I think of like renovating a house, but you still have to function. So how do we create an environment where we're really transforming a structure, really like gutting it, because we have to gut patriarchy and systems of privilege, because power is intoxicating in our culture, because we're raised to believe that it is. So how do we do that while simultaneously building a critical mass of women at the table and hoping that will change the landscape, and then creating a blueprint or a roadmap to move forward?
Okay, I think there's several pieces that go into this. I'll go back to what I was saying before of running for office for the right reasons. You know, when you run for office because it's the next best thing in your career, because you have nothing else to do with $8 million, because, I mean, not throwing shade at anyone, or simply because you think that you are God's gift to your community, because there are many people who walk around our districts like that. The problem with running for those reasons is that once you can tell the world whatever you think they need to hear in order to elect you, and then you'll get into office and you will compromise every single one of your alleged beliefs because they weren't your beliefs in the first place. So when you have people who have been close to the pain because they've themselves or someone they love have experienced it, they've done the work, they've really run for the right reasons, you're going to get the kind, hopefully, of elected official who isn't wavering in their own ethics. in being able to say, I'm going to make this decision because even if I have to compromise a little bit, I'm going to be able to sleep at night. And I'm doing it for the improvement and the betterment of my community, not so that I can keep that power that I now could be addicted to. Now, I've had plenty of opportunities to side with the idea of keeping power. And when I got elected, I knew, I have a career as a lawyer, that if this didn't work out, I'd be more than happy to step out and let somebody else lead, because it wasn't about me, it was about what my community needed. And when you think of it that way, when you think of that power structure that way, it's a much easier decision to go in and dismantle. But it's also something you have to recognize that when you're new, I'm no longer a new member, but when you're new, you don't have that much power to change things. You gotta start building bridges. Build bridges to the folks who, even those who may not agree with you always, because you may need them for something. And you build those kinds of relationships with advocates. I know Stanley since I ran, and we've been running in these streets for a number of other reasons. And you build that kind of relationship that says, I see you, you see me, and you know that we're fighting for the same thing. And so when that bad signal goes out on an issue, whether it's 58 that we were all fighting for, whether it's other types of criminal justice reform, whether it's the Sexual Harassment Working Group, when that bad signal goes out to our allies, everybody shows up. And everybody shows up to fight. And that's that other kind of leadership where you can count on certain folks who show up for you. And so I say this because that's the kind of thing that those elected officials who don't understand that this isn't about them, that this seat, this job doesn't belong to them, it belongs to the people, are going to be more than willing and happy to compromise their alleged beliefs in order to keep that power. And I think of the relationships, and I think of the people that it is affecting. And that's how we end up with the kind of culture in Albany that has allowed sexual harassment to go on for so long. Because when you run, you'll say whatever it is. And when you got there, if you saw it happening right in front of your eyes, you'll look the other way and you'll just keep on going about your daily life. But that's not what we're going to do anymore. That is not what we're going to do. I will tell a brief story without saying names or too much detail. About 2-3 years ago, we were at one of the various parties that happen in Albany, political gatherings that happen in Albany. And a staffer for someone touched inappropriately a staffer for somebody else. And both Robin and I were there, and all hell broke loose because that was not about to happen in front of us. And we respected this staffer's choice and willingness to come forward and do whatever it was that this staffer wanted to do, because it was about protecting the staffer. But if you have someone looking at this happening and you stay quiet and you do nothing, and you're an elected official, as Stanley was saying, you're trash. You're absolute trash, and you don't deserve your seat. And so don't compromise. And if you do compromise a little too much, we vote you out.
Yeah, I Assembly member, that's so true. And I do want to say one thing. There was an amazing article in The Nation by Alexis Grinnell called "Mediocre Men Have Failed New York." And she references a paper, a study that was done in 2005 by 2 psychology professors that showed that when a system is in a dire place, whether it be a private company or public institution like government, women are tended to be put in the position of power to bring us out, right? So when we are, it's called the glass cliff. So when this institution is at its worst and needs to be lifted up and repaired, it is women who assume those roles of power. And yes, I think, Stanley talked about this in his introduction about how there's a type of feminine approach to using power and to governing, if you will. And that does inherently bring more compassion and kindness and care to the position. But we need to be clear here and recognize that being a woman or identifying yourself as a woman does not inherently make you better as a leader. And it does not make you better in holding power, because I know firsthand that there are women in power who are worse than men in power when it comes to standing with survivors. And I think it is very important to recognize that regardless of your gender or your gender identity, you can still be a power abuser and you can still protect power abusers. And so that's why it's important for everybody, right? Not just the women. And yes, it is more likely for women to stand up for other women, but we also need to be able to be willing to hold other women accountable when they do not have the willingness or courage to show that institutional courage. Catalina and her chief of staff, Robin, showed that at that party, right? But I bet you there were elected officials, other women in that room who saw the same thing go down and turn their heads. And so we cannot be picking and choosing who we choose to hold accountable, and we cannot pick and choose who we allow to compromise to a certain level. Women in powerful positions do not deserve the right to compromise more just because they are women. Everybody needs to be held accountable for the compromises that they choose to make.
Thank you, Erica. It's 2:13, so I want to transition to some of the questions that have been coming in to all of you. And since we're talking about politics and Albany, I think it's fitting that we start with this question. What is the role of the voter when it comes to holding elected officials accountable? Let's start with Assemblymember Cruz on that one.
I think the first thing is showing up and actually voting. You know, it's, and I say this as the elected who represents a district with the lowest voting turnout in the entire state of New York. And so, you know, we want to act like we are the kind of society where voting is something that happens all the time. But we saw last night, for those of us in New York City, how difficult it was to get people to show up at the polls. Erica was working a campaign that I was supporting, and it is tough. And so I think that's the first thing. I think the other thing is really question in depth. You know, elected officials, of people running, love to give you one-liners when they come and they meet you, or when they knock on your door, or when you see them on TV. They love to give you that top line and say that they're going to do X, Y, and Z without really getting into depth about how they're going to do it. And I'm not just talking about that infinite question of how you're going to pay for it, because it isn't just about how you're going to pay for it. That's part of how are you going to deliver for us as a community. But if they tell you, I'll use an example. If they tell you that they support immigrants, how do you support immigrants? What have you done, or what do you plan to do, and how do you plan to deliver it? Well, I want to combat sexual harassment in the workplace. How? Do you know that the laws that are out there? Do you know what we need to be doing? I think if we allow folks running for office to get away too often with knowing absolutely nothing about what they're talking about. And it is very sad, you know, because we have folks who may be very well intentioned, but they will get up on a microphone and say things like, New York City needs domestic violence shelters. Come on, guys. We may not have the best ones, but we have them. And we're okay with that type of mediocre person running for office. So we ourselves as voters need to do better. And we also need to do better by not voting for those folks just because, you know, they have a funny meme or a catchy line, or they happen to have the greatest commercial. No, vote for the kind of person who really gives you a plan of action, who isn't going negative on their opponents simply because they feel like they're losing. So that is, I think, the main thing that the voter can do. And importantly, when they get elected, hold them to task. Hold them to task, because folks who run for office love making promises and breaking them. When I ran, I would often tell my voters, I am one of 150 members. I will fight like hell for the issues that I believe in, but I cannot promise you that I will make them happen, because it isn't just up to me. And until we as electeds talk more honestly to people, they're going to continue to mistrust politicians. And so you ask in depth and you hold them accountable. If they said that they were going to fight gentrification, for example, and then during the campaign or the re-election an article comes out that they were actually taking money from developers, how hard do you think they're going to fight? So hold people accountable. The words that come out of their mouth need to be matched by their actions. And if they're not, support someone else to run against them.
I want to add to that those really important messages by saying you can also sometimes tell. I mean, you know, campaigns can be small or they can be large. They can be $8 million or more. And, you know, there's a couple of things I think we should be asking candidates when they're candidates, because there is already information we know about how this person leadership has carried out in their lives. It is not enough for people to come forward and say, here's what I will do when and if. You need to ask them, what have they done and what are they doing? They are employers if they have campaign staff. And some of these questions about what are the principles that you hold as an employer of your staff now and before, you know, so I think those two things are really critical, how aware they are of the policies in their current or previous job, if they're moving jobs, how aware are they of how their staff are treated and what the culture is like. You could say, what's the culture like on your campaign? When you were working at your law firm, did your company support caregiving, and was there a policy against sexual harassment? And if not, what did you think about that? I mean, these folks have decades of experience in the workplace that they're coming into. It is not a blank slate. And I think with the news cycle, with social media, also, by the way, with public funding, there are opportunities that we have now to put people on notice by asking these critical questions that are not limited to a debate platform that can really show, you know, what the person and their leadership style is all about. And I think while, you know, you may have a campaign platform on the issues, it doesn't necessarily speak to you and your values as a leader. And so much of that leadership pervades what happens in the culture of your organization or organization. So I think asking people about the culture of work, what kind of leader are they? What kind of culture do they want to see in the workplace when they become elected? And what are they doing for their campaign workers now? And it would be interesting to see, you know, what answers you get. There are people who have decided to get ahead of that and establish policies. They exist, they're out there. They're recommendations that any politician can find to say, like, how do I run ethically, a safe, ethical, and equitable campaign? What does that look like? And I think we have an opportunity looking into the next cycles to sort of try to uphold some of those standards. And, you know, I think people want you to not think about their past. They want to talk about what they're going to do. But, you know, people, like they say, like, you know, people are who they are and they show you who they are. And I think it's easy to, you know, kind of brush things under the rug during a campaign, but ask those critical questions about culture.
Thank you, Latifa. Just a time check, we're at 2:20. So I want to throw out another question to the panel. This is a big one. What models or examples are out there in the workplace that have successfully challenged or changed the system of power structures? And what were the factors in their success?
Well, I can start. Power structures, there's lots of different ways that you can think about that, but I would certainly say that the dynamics of organizing and the dynamics of folks' ability to organize as workers, whether they're formally unionized or not, is a major factor in how employees have the ability and the agency to show up. And so you know, there are worker centers, there's a lot of new models of organizing. You know, there's a lot of new models of organizing that are happening when in dominated industries like caregiving and domestic workers or women. And when those organizing efforts take place, the dynamic changes. And so together there's more power. And there's an assumption, as we know, both, there's an assumption and also an effort to keep organizing as dissipated as possible. But there are, I think that sense of agency and power and bargaining is really critical. And that's one example, which we know is not what it used to look like, and for sure, and not often where there are women-dominated occupations.
Yeah, I definitely agree, Latifa. I think we sort of saw this on the city council level. Organizing and unionization efforts had started before former council member King was brought up on ethics charges, but when he was not expelled the first time, that certainly propelled the conversation a little quicker and more publicly as well. Seeing staffers really stepping out into the public and organizing in such a public way. State legislative staffers cannot organize in that way. They cannot unionize. So that's definitely something, that we see and I believe will be successful for city council staffers. And I would love to see happen on the state level as well. And another thing, and, I don't know if we can call this a success yet, but I do think it can happen. The Connecticut state legislature did anonymous climate surveys. And again, this is something that Dr. Jennifer Frey talks about a lot is climate surveys, where people, staffers, people in a workspace can really talk openly and freely about how they're feeling and the type of work environment that's being created for them. And you cannot solve a problem if you don't know what it is in the first place. You need those facts. You need the data and the details. And anonymous climate surveys can really do that. And look, this kind of goes back again to what Stanley said in his intro, that means having hard conversations, right? Getting the hard, difficult information that can be really uncomfortable for people in a position of power to look at, especially those who might think that maybe they're not creating a perfect work environment, but it's okay. Things are all right. Staff turnover is okay. It's not huge, it's not high, but so we're doing what we can. But if climate surveys allow the people on the ground who are doing the work to be able to voice how they're truly feeling, and then provide them the opportunity to be a part of the solution. And so, I know the Connecticut state legislature has really started to look into those. And I think that, anonymous surveys, climate surveys would be incredibly helpful and can be a really good model to be implemented.
And Erica, if I may add something on the climate surveys, and sometimes a little bit of more of an official hand is needed. I have a bill that basically would force employers over a certain amount that have a certain amount of employees to actually report on those same kind of information and into the Division of Human Rights, because how do we figure out how to resolve a problem if we don't have enough data on it? And so salary ranges, when someone started, other demographics, if they get a promotion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so combining that with something like what you're saying, it's how we get the data to kind of get to the root of the problem.
I just one quick addition is like just a very simple staffer bill of rights as a first step. I travel to Albany a lot for work. When I do, they take care of my room and board. They take care of food, because the assumption is if you're going to be traveling this much to do this work, we want to make sure that you have the basic necessities covered. There are staffers who have to travel to Albany. They don't even get it per diem. They're just traveling to Albany off of the passion for the work and vibes. Meanwhile, the elected official has per diem. They're good to go. We know they got the salary. They just got salary increases, and that staffer might be making $60,000 a year living in New York City, where a one-bedroom apartment costs $10,000 a month plus half of your soul. So there's some very simple things we can do right now to make things slightly easier for folks. And then also, COVID has taught us very clearly the toll that the amount of work that parents have to put in. And no disrespect to my dads out there, but the amount of work that moms have to put in. Because until you've had to have a planning meeting with somebody who has 3 kids who are virtual learning on one laptop with shaky Wi-Fi, like you don't understand how hard it can be to be a mother in real time. And like, what are we doing to make sure that like we're not just like paying people equitably, but also being like, hey, you're doing a lot. How about a couple of days off on the house or a bonus or something, just something, because it's just, you know, I've seen lots of mothers with heaven and earth, and now we're all expected to go back into the world like they didn't just have to do that. So,
Thank you, Stanley. And we are transitioning now. It's 2:27, but I want to thank all of our panelists. I'm going to hand it over to our fearless leader, Beverly Neufeld. But I just want to thank you all for your comments and your commitment and your passion. It's been a real pleasure. And I look forward to furthering these conversations. Take it away, Bev.
Oh, thanks so much, Karen. Well, I think my job was to encapsulate, you know, what was discussed. That would be absolutely impossible. I've just taken so many notes and I finally gave up because you just all covered so much information. This has been a fascinating, thoughtful, and I think a very brave conversation. And we're also appreciative to you, Latifa, Senator Cruz, Stanley, Erica, and of course, to our wonderful moderator, Karen King. I also just want to take a moment to thank the PowHer team. Mary Luke, who's VP of PowHer, did an amazing job putting this all together. Abby Grimshaw, our online manager, Rye Walker, a program associate, and Nancy Hafner, our super volunteer. This is a really thoughtful conversation because of the work and thought that was put into crafting it. So I don't want to minimize this amazing dialogue and wrap it up, you know, but I do want to challenge us we've heard so many great ideas. What's next? This is not meant to be a one-stop conversation. This is meant to be a kickoff. And I think we have so great next steps ahead, more conversations, you know, deeper dives. But I do want to say this. I do want to say that PowHer commits to doing something. We commit to continuing this conversation, going deeper. We commit to making New York State a laboratory for change, which Latifa, you made such an important point about. How are we going to create the change? We commit to stepping up when we see harassment and we can do something about it. I guess what I'm saying is we commit to having the institutional courage that everyone talked about. And I want to invite everybody who's on this call, on this event, you know, send us a note, tell us how you can be part of this. I want to challenge you to find the ways you can step up, the way you can show your bravery, run for office despite everything that you've heard of today. And the way some of the men, where you can have less trash, as Stanley put it. But I think what we need to do, all of us, is we need to make a commitment to fighting for this transformational change that's necessary. It's necessary for the women and folks who are working. It's necessary for the institutions. But I think, you know, if we want to really create that world of inclusive gender justice, of equity, of equitable recovery, that we really need to address this head on. And PowHer is committed to doing that. And we invite everyone to continue the conversation and the work with us. So thank you very much, and expect to hear from us in the fall. You'll get a link to this wonderful webinar, and so you can go back and listen to all the great points. And you know, it's given a lot to think about. We have the summer. We'll come back with some plans to move forward. Thank you all, and really appreciate everyone's joining us today.